Can You Forgive Her by Anthony Trollope. This novel was published really as Trollope was coming into the fullness of his career. It was a serial publication between January 1864 and August 1865. 20 episodes, and it is quite a long novel. In the published form today, Oxford World Classics, 675 pages. So of those 20 instalments, each one was really quite lengthy. As it transpired, it is the first in Trollope's series of novels known as the Palliser novels. These are the parliamentary novels. They're much more about the mechanism, the machinery, the process of government through the British parliamentary system than they are political in terms of political ideas, political factions. The series of novels includes Phineas Finn, Phineas Redux, the Prime Minister and the Duke's Children. At the time of writing Can You Forgive Her, Trollope wasn't aware of the fact that he was starting a series of novels. This series emerged out of, really, I think, his enjoyment of writing many of the characters who continue to appear novel after novel, especially Plantagenet Palliser and Glencora McCluskey Palliser, in that she's married to Plantagenet Palliser. The novel has a number of broad characteristics. It is really all about the governing class. It depicts the aristocracy and also, in great part, the gentry, the landed gentry of England, Scotland, of the period. The characters are very diverse. They are rich in diversity. The different types of character that one encounters in the novel is very richly diverse. And the characters are described very detailedly and very capably. All of the characterization is extremely interesting. The prose style of the novel is highly readable, given the fact that the novel was written well over 100 years ago now. It continues to be quite a paced-up read, quite amusing. There's lots of conversation in the writing style, and the conversations are quite pithy, quite enjoyable, and really at times quite funny. There is as well an omniscient narrator, which by implication means that the narrator is everywhere in the story, everywhere in throughout the telling of the story, and of course has a very knowing position within the story. The narrator doesn't claim to know everything. Sometimes the narrator is speculative about how the characters are feeling or how the characters are thinking or what their motivations might be. The narrator, as is understandable, doesn't give the plot away. That would not be a good move on the part of the author, but the author and the narrator are different. It's possible to find passages in the novel where opinions and ideas discussed by the narrator do not necessarily concur with ideas held by the author, because the novel and the outcomes of the novel don't necessarily uphold things that the narrator has said on the way through, or ideas or principles or ideals that the narrator has spoken about don't necessarily find themselves upheld by the outcomes of the plot. The narrator takes an unassuming approach towards the reader, a very friendly approach. It's the confident, casual voice of the governing class. It is, of course, a male voice, which would be the most accurate voice for the governing class of that period. I said before that it's a long novel, and with the serial publication, often novels took on their own length because they weren't necessarily planned before the novel was started in the serial. If a book was popular, if a book or a story was popular in a periodical, then the number of issues that it would appear in might well be increased. If it was unpopular, the number of issues it might appear in could well be decreased. So Trollope was honest about the fact that he didn't necessarily know for sure where a novel was going to go at the outset of writing it. And he said in his autobiography, which he wrote in 1883, when I sit down to write a novel, I do not at all know, and I do not very much care how it is to end. All that having been said, this novel is very well structured. The plot is well balanced. The conception of the novel ultimately to the reader feels very complete and very satisfying. There is an emotional completion and an artistic completion. It's a very well executed novel. Where the novel is so incredibly long and deals with so many very diverse characters who find themselves across a variety of situations, sometimes due to their social status, if they're higher born or less well born within the governing class, sometimes to do with their finances. So some people will be trying to climb up the tree, others will be perhaps sliding down the tree and trying to avoid that slip. Whilst there will be those who are in power, who are powerful, and who are vying for better positions. And all of this with this extremely diverse cast that Trollope has created. So that there are, of course, many themes within the novel, but perhaps we might single out at this point two to keep things simple. And the first one that we probably need to bring forward is the theme of power. The novel is very much about power. Almost everything that I just said about the characters as well demonstrates how much the novel is about power. Succinctly, we might say that the novel is discussing the social machinery whereby power is invested in certain individuals. It will be through birth. At least the initial qualification will come through birth. In order to enter Parliament, it was necessary in those days to have quite a lot of money behind one. There would need to be a personal fortune, a private fortune, or there would need to be backing from the family. Often second sons went into Parliament, not always, but often they did. However, they would have been heavily backed financially in doing this by their birth family, who probably were landed. So there's this social machinery which enables power, and then within the basic construct of the governing class, there would be the way in which people operate to achieve greater power. There is as well in this novel a quite vivid depiction of the parliamentary process, how an individual enters Parliament, what the process of entering Parliament is. And this is exposed to be really quite corrupt. Certainly by today's standards, very corrupt. Trollope, I don't think, though, evinces a great deal of criticism towards this aspect of the system. The other major theme in the novel really is what are the women of the governing class to do. So whilst the governing class governs, the activity of that process, the meaningful activity of that process, is of course allocated to the men. What are the women to do? What is their role? Of course they're supporting their husbands, that was typical of the period. But if they themselves wish to have personal fulfillment, what are they to do? What can they do? And the novel unfolds the story of three women in particular, whose lives are really not filled with any very great occupation, certainly not filled with vocation. There is a level of occupation which, in at least two of the instances, tends to become a preoccupation, and that is the occupation of marriage, the occupation of getting married and the occupation of being married. So we have three women who are mainly looked at in this respect. Alice Vavasor, who is an unmarried young woman and who at the start of the novel is engaged, who breaks her engagement and becomes engaged to another man. It's a relatively unusual decision for a young woman at this period to have made. So she's a young woman, she doesn't have a career, she doesn't have a clear political focus for the women's rights movement. Nevertheless, she's been influenced by the women's rights movement, and she's beginning to assert a level of independence, but she doesn't really have a channel through which to express it. Then the next woman of these three that I've suggested is Glencora McCluskey Palliser. So McCluskey, the maiden name, and Palliser, the married name. Glencora is in an arranged marriage. She's an Erin. Glencora has married Plantagenet Palliser somewhat against her will. It's an arranged marriage, and she's been pretty much coerced into it by her people. She was in love, and very much in love, with somebody else, whom it probably would not have been a good idea for her to have married. But having been forced or coerced into marrying somebody else, of course the romanticism of her first love, first crush, is probably exacerbated. And so we see a struggle for Glencora between being a married woman and expressing her true love, her true passion, her true sexuality, which is to contravene at this period very seriously social codes surrounding marriage. The third woman of this trio is Mrs. Greenough, who is related to Alice. And Mrs. Greenough is a widow. She married late to a husband who was really quite wealthy, and now she's a widow. There are no children, and she's a widow with quite a lot of money behind her. she doesn't need to remarry. She's financially independent and she can really live the life that she wants to live quite freely and quite easily. But two suitors descend upon her, both of whom are really quite mercenary in their intentions. For some reason, Mrs. Greenough feels that she does need to get married, and she chooses not to search beyond these two mercenary suitors. Perhaps her assumption is that all her suitors will be mercenary by this stage, although Trollope emphasises that she is a very good-looking woman. She does eventually choose one of the suitors, having sort of played them off between one another, and herself having dithered quite a lot about the decision that she's going to make one way or the other. So these three women are in very different situations, and yet the main preoccupation of their lives is their marriage, whether they should get married, whether they will continue to stay married despite not being in love, whether they will re-enter marriage. Of the three women, Alice Vavasor is, of course, the protagonist. Alice and her indecision about her marriage is the underlying driving force of the plot in this novel. We might say that other characters eventually become of greater interest to us as readers. We might say that other characters are eventually the ones who drive the series of the Palliser novels. But Alice's dilemma underlyingly drives this novel, and it's the recurrent main interest to which the novel turns time and time again. Indecision is not perhaps the most attractive of qualities to try to illustrate. And Trollope did not really like the character of Alice in this novel. He says, again in his autobiography, it's chapter 10, the character of the girl, that is to say Alice, is carried through with considerable strength, but is not attractive. I think it's more this indecision, the difficulty that Alice is having in deciding whom she's going to marry, or whether perhaps she's going to marry at all, that causes her to appear unattractive. She is an intelligent woman. She is emotionally complex, at the same time as being conscientious. She's not selfish, she's not demanding. She is perhaps subdued. We may ask ourselves whether Alice is a woman who is suffering from having lost her mother at a very early age as an infant, that she hasn't had that feminine guidance to help her through the rites of passage of moving from a girl into womanhood, of trying to make decisions about one's happiness in life, socially, but also as a woman, fulfillment as a woman, fulfillment in the love relationship of one's life as a woman, fulfillment as a mother, as a member of a family. Her father is a very detached character. He is simply not present, and he is not available to Alice in the respect of engaging with her closely and intimately with regard to her life and her future. He does care, and behind the scenes he tries to help, but he doesn't help Alice directly, which does seem a little strange. Alice's dilemma was a relatively universal one for the period. In this social group, there wasn't really a lot of outlet for a woman unless she got married. There were the activities of philanthropy, and some women, of course, engaged with those activities, threw themselves into them, devoted their lives to them very wholeheartedly, and led fulfilling lives in that way. But if you were a woman who wanted a family, then there was very little outlet in life apart from simply getting married and becoming a mother. There wouldn't be a great deal of other future. Perhaps later on there'd be philanthropy, but it wouldn't probably seem like, for the majority of women at that period in that social group, the mainstay of one's life. There was no real work for a woman to do, no real career that she could follow with stages of progress. The problem with marriage, though, was that in getting married, of course, a woman relinquished a lot of her own autonomy, a lot of her own power. Alice is perhaps unusual in this novel as a young woman in that her father gives her a lot of freedom, allows her to come and to go independently on her own. She travels into Europe with simply the company of another unmarried female cousin and a male cousin whom, interestingly, George Vavasor, to whom she's been previously engaged. This seems very free for the period, quite unusually free for the period. But then women were gaining more independence, and they were gaining more right to take responsibility for their own conduct at this period. So there was something for Alice to lose in getting married. She has a small independent income of £400 per annum. It's certainly enough to keep her comfortably and to keep her as a gentlewoman. Not riches, but very comfortable. And the disposal of that would have been lost to her in getting married. Many husbands, allowed their wives because it was a matter left to the husband's discretion to maintain their private incomes and to use their private incomes for themselves. But it wasn't a right, it wasn't a legal right that a woman could do that. So Alice does have a fair bit of independence to lose in getting married. So despite this dilemma, I think the way in which the audience or the readership is to regard Alice is really quite detached, really quite judgmental. In the very first page of the novel, Trollope puts to the reader, Alice Vavasor, whose offence against the world I am to tell you, and if possible to excuse, was the daughter of John Vavasor. The offence is, of course, having jilted her lover, having jilted the man to whom she's been engaged, first of all engaged to George Vavasor. At the start of the novel, she's engaged to John Grey. And then she again jilts John Grey. And I won't go on with the plot from there, but I think even just these initial indecisions and changes of mind that the reader has to consider forgiving. And it is a very formal request. It's quite as if society has the right to judge Alice for this, which probably society at the period considered it did have the right to judge Alice for this chopping and changing in this particular area of life.